In the small town of Ravenwood, the sun beat down on the courthouse, casting long shadows over the steps as dear Angela Matthews made her way towards the entrance. She was used to walking these steps, but never for something like this today. She wasn't here as a professor or a respected member of the legal community. She was here as a defendant. The weight of the ticket in her bag felt heavier than it should have as she reached for the door and pushed it open. Stepping into the cool air-conditioned courtroom, she straightened her posture and adjusted her blazer with practiced precision, as if the very act of presenting herself with confidence would deflect any unfair treatment she might face. The room was familiar yet oddly cold as the judge took his seat at the bench, his robes flowing around him with authority, his stern face hiding years of experience and an even harsher reputation. He was Judge Charles Bennett, a man known for his no-nonsense approach to the law. He was fair, some would say, but many others saw him as too rigid, too quick to impose harsh fines and penalties, without much consideration for the stories of those who stood before him. Angela took a seat near the front, her eyes scanning the room. She'd seen it all before: the stark walls, the old wooden furniture, the faint smell of paper and ink that seemed to linger from a bygone era. The court proceedings began, and Judge Bennett called out her case without a second glance at her face. He was flipping through paperwork, reviewing the details, as though the person standing before him was just another name on a list to him. Angela was just another defendant, just another case to tick off and move on from. As he looked up briefly, his eyes met hers, but for only a fraction of a second before he moved on. His words were sharp and dismissive. He didn't even give her a chance to explain the details of the traffic violation. As she tried to speak her piece, he interrupted her mid-sentence, his voice cutting through the air with authority. No time for excuses, no room for discussion. He had made his mind up already, and the fine was decided. The amount was larger than she expected, almost punitive in its severity. Angela could feel her pulse quicken, her stomach tightening at the unfairness of it. She had been respectful and calm, yet all of that seemed irrelevant in the face of the judge's unyielding gaze. She didn't say anything. She simply nodded and accepted his decision, the sting of the fine settling deep in her chest. Though she remained composed on the outside, she knew that this wasn't just about the ticket. It was about something deeper: the way the system so often disregarded people like her, how it seemed designed to make her feel small and insignificant despite everything she had accomplished in her life. As the gavel struck and the session moved on, Angela stood up and made her way to the door, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. The eyes of the courtroom followed her as she left, but none of them seemed to register who she truly was. They only saw the defendant, the woman who had been fined. They didn't see the professor, the educator, the one who shaped the minds of future lawyers who would one day stand in front of judges like Charles Bennett. And maybe in a way she could only hope that they would remember her lessons, even if he would not remember her. Angela stepped out into the warm sunlight, the courthouse door closing behind her with a soft thud. She stood on the steps for a moment, taking in a deep breath, trying to ground herself. The fine was heavy, but it wasn't the money that stung. It was the feeling of being dismissed, of being treated as if her accomplishments, her expertise, and her role in shaping future lawyers meant nothing in the eyes of the system she worked so hard to navigate. She could already feel the familiar stir of frustration rising within her, the feeling that she had just been another black woman subjected to a biased system that too often didn't see her humanity, her intellect, or her value. She exhaled slowly, forcing herself to stay calm. There was no use in letting her emotions rule her. Not now, not in front of anyone. But as she made her way to her car, her thoughts raced. One had made him impose such a heavy fine. She had tried to explain that it was a momentary lapse in judgment, a mistake made in the rush to get home after a long day at the university. But Judge Bennett hadn't given her the chance to finish. He had cut her off with a dismissive gesture, his mind already made up. It wasn't about justice. It wasn't even about the law. It was about control, power, and a disregard for people like her. As Angela drove back to her apartment, the weight of the fine seemed to settle in deeper. It wasn't just about this one instance. It was about a lifetime of experiences like this. The times she had been overlooked, the moments where her voice had been silenced in classrooms or wardrooms, the way people sometimes looked right past her achievements as though she were invisible. But today was different. Today, It felt like a slap in the face. She was no longer just a professor. She was no longer just someone who could navigate the halls of academia with ease. Today, she was a black woman in a courtroom, fighting for dignity, fighting for recognition, and fighting against the subtle biases that so many in positions of power didn't even realize they had. Back at home, Angela tried to shake off the discomfort. She pulled out her lesson plans for the next class, focusing on the work ahead. She couldn't let this moment derail her. She had students to teach, minds to shape, and a future to build. But even as she went through the motions of preparing for her next lecture, her mind kept returning to Judge Bennett. He had seemed so certain in his judgment, so sure that his decision was right. But what if he didn't know who he was dealing with? What if he didn't understand the weight of what he had done? The next morning, as Angela prepared for her lecture on constitutional law, she couldn't help but wonder if she would ever have the chance to confront Judge Bennett, to make him understand how his actions had impacted her. Would he even care? Or was he so wrapped up in his own sense of authority that he couldn't see beyond his own perspective? The questions lingered as she made her way to the university, hoping that her students would offer a sense of purpose, a reminder that the work she did was important, no matter the obstacles she faced. The university campus was bustling as usual when Angela arrived, the familiar hum of student conversations and the shuffle of footsteps filling the air. It was a welcome contrast to the sterile and oppressive atmosphere of the courthouse. She couldn't shake the unease from the day before, but the routine of preparing for class was grounding. As she walked down the hallway toward her lecture hall, she tried to push away the lingering thoughts of Judge Bennett and the unjust fine. Today was about her students. Today was about teaching, sharing knowledge, and instilling a sense of justice in the next generation of lawyers. As Angela entered the classroom, her eyes scanned the faces of the students already seated. The room was filled with eager young minds, ready to engage in a discussion about constitutional law. But then, something caught her attention, a familiar face in the back of the room. She blinked, her heart skipping a beat. There, seated among the students, was none other than Judge Charles Bennett. For a moment, time seemed to slow down. Angela stood frozen in the doorway, her mind racing. What was he doing here? How did he end up in her class? She had heard that judges sometimes took continuing education courses, but she never expected to see him, of all people, enrolled in one of hers. Her first instinct was to turn around and leave, but she quickly realized that would be unprofessional and childish. Instead, she straightened her back, took a deep breath, and walked to the front of the room, forcing herself to focus. Angela began the lecture, but her mind kept drifting back to Judge Bennett. He was sitting quietly in the back, his eyes fixed on the lecture notes, but she could feel his presence. His body language was different from the students. Where they seemed engaged, scribbling notes and asking questions, he was tense, distant, as if he were trying to hide in plain sight. She couldn't help but notice how out of place he seemed. The whole situation felt surreal. As she spoke about the history of constitutional law, Angela tried to push aside the thoughts of the courtroom. But every time she glanced toward the back of the room, she felt a wave of discomfort. There was something unsettling about seeing him in her classroom. The same man who had dismissed her just days ago, the man who had imposed a fine without even recognizing her. How could he sit there so calm, while she had been forced to endure the indignity of his decision? She steeled herself, determined not to let this moment throw her off course. She was here to teach, not to let her emotions take control. So she continued with the lecture, diving into case studies, discussing key Supreme Court rulings, and encouraging her students to think critically about the intersection of law and justice. But even as she spoke, she felt Judge Bennett's gaze on her, a weight that was hard to ignore. She couldn't help but wonder if he even recognized her. As the lecture came to a close, Angela wrapped up the class with a final thought on the importance of fairness in the judicial system. She kept her tone neutral, professional, but inside, she was anything but calm. She knew that she couldn't let this moment pass without addressing it. She needed answers, and she needed them now. She watched as the students packed up their things and filtered out of the room, but Judge Bennett remained seated. When the last student had left, Angela took a deep breath and walked toward the back of the room. She stopped in front of his desk, standing tall. "Judge Bennett," she said, her voice steady but tinged with an edge. "I didn't expect to see you here." He looked up at her, his face slightly pale. He seemed to hesitate before responding, the weight of the moment settling in. Judge Bennett looked up at Angela, his expression momentarily faltering before he composed himself. There was an air of uncertainty about him that Angela hadn't expected. He had always projected an image of authority, a man who stood firm in his decisions, no matter the consequences. But now, in the dim light of her classroom, that confidence seemed to waver. "Dr. Matthews," he began, his voice soft, "I didn't expect this either. I'm not sure what to say." Angela crossed her arms, her gaze unwavering. "You didn't recognize me in court, did you?" Her words were not accusatory, but they carried the weight of the question that had been gnawing at her since the moment she saw him. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his hands resting on the desk as if they might steady him. No, I didn't. I should have," he admitted, his voice laced with a genuine regret that Angela hadn't anticipated. "I've made a lot of judgments in my time on the bench, but that day He trailed off, clearly struggling to find the right words. Angela exhaled slowly, not sure what she expected from him. An apology? An explanation? She had no idea, but what she did know was that she wasn't about to let him off easy. "You find me without even giving me a chance to speak, without even recognizing who I am," she said, her voice firm but measured. "As a law professor, as someone who's dedicated my career to teaching fairness, I can't help but feel a little disrespected." Judge Bennett looked down at his hands, the weight of her words sinking in. I didn't intend to disrespect you," he murmured. "It was just, I've been doing this for so long, I sometimes forget that everyone in front of me has their own story." Angela raised an eyebrow. "You forget? You, a judge, who's supposed to be a guardian of justice, forgets that every individual who stands before you is a human being with their own complexities, their own experiences. That's a dangerous mindset, Judge." He flinched at her words, but Angela wasn't done. She leaned in slightly, her eyes narrowing. "Do you know what it's like, Judge Bennett, to walk into a room and have people already judge you before you've even said a word? To be dismissed not for who you are, but for what others assume you are. You don't even have to ask me what it's like. You've seen it in the courtroom. You've done it." For a long moment, there was silence. Angela's words hung in the air, thick with the tension of unspoken truths. She knew she wasn't the only one who had faced this kind of injustice, but right now, it felt personal. It felt as though she were speaking not just for herself, but for all the others who had been dismissed, overlooked, and unfairly judged. Finally, Judge Bennett spoke again, his voice quieter this time. "I've never really thought about it like that," he admitted, almost as though the realization was new to him. "I've always believed I was doing my job, following the law as I understand it. But maybe I've been too blind to see what's right in front of me." Angela softened slightly, though she remained vigilant. "It's not just about the law, Judge. It's about how we apply it. It's about recognizing that justice is not always as clear-cut as we like to think. You don't get to decide someone's fate based on assumptions, and you don't get to ignore the impact of your decisions." He nodded slowly, his eyes meeting hers for the first time with a level of sincerity that Angela hadn't expected. "I understand, and I'm sorry. I'm sorry for the fine, and I'm sorry for not recognizing who you are, not just as a law professor, but as a person who deserved to be heard." Angela looked at him, her mind racing. Was this genuine? Was he really reflecting on his actions? Or was this just a momentary realization that would fade once the conversation was over? "I'm not sure that an apology is enough," she said quietly, her voice steady. "But it's a start. Now, let's see what you do with it." Judge Bennett sat in silence, processing her words. Angela didn't expect immediate change, but she hoped that this moment, this conversation, could be the catalyst for something more. Something real. Over the next few days, Angela couldn't shake the conversation she had with Judge Bennett. It lingered in her thoughts, both a source of hope and a reminder of how difficult it was to challenge the status quo. She had spoken her truth, and in that moment, it felt like he truly listened. But was that enough? Was an apology enough to undo the damage done? Was it enough to rebuild trust? She tried to move forward, focusing on her students, her lectures, and her research. She poured herself into her work, knowing that it was her teaching that could make the most lasting impact. But the encounter with Judge Bennett kept resurfacing, like a thorn she couldn't remove. It wasn't just about the fine anymore, it was about something deeper. It was about how easy it was for people in power to forget their responsibility to the people they serve. How, sometimes, the system was just a series of faces and numbers, with little regard for the stories behind them. One afternoon, after finishing her last class for the day, Angela returned to her office to find an envelope waiting on her desk. It was thick, formal-looking, and stamped with the insignia of the courthouse. Her stomach tightened as she opened it, half expecting to find another citation or some form of reprimand. But instead, she found a letter from Judge Bennett. The letter was brief but meaningful. In it, he apologized again, not just for the fine but for his lack of awareness. He admitted that he had been blind to the biases in his own approach to the law, and he expressed his desire to make amends, not just with her, but with the broader community. The letter ended with an invitation to speak at a judicial seminar he was organizing, where he hoped to have a dialogue on racial justice, fairness, and the role of empathy in the legal system. Angela stared at the letter for a long moment, her mind whirling. She had expected an apology, but this, an invitation to speak to judges and lawyers about the very issues she had raised. It felt surreal. She was both flattered and cautious. It was one thing to apologize and quite another to act on that apology in a meaningful way. But part of her knew that this could be an opportunity to challenge the very system that had failed her and so many others, and to hold people in power accountable for their actions. After a moment's hesitation, Angela picked up her phone and dialed the number listed in the letter. She had a decision to make. The conversation that followed was brief, but she could tell that Judge Bennett was earnest. He was trying, in his own way, to make things right. He acknowledged the difficulty of confronting these uncomfortable truths, but he seemed determined to create a space for change. Angela agreed to attend the seminar, though with reservations. She told him she would need time to prepare, and that she would only participate if the conversation was genuinely focused on reform and accountability, not just window dressing. As the days passed, Angela found herself thinking more and more about the possibility of using this platform to drive change. She knew that it would be risky, that speaking out against a system she had once been part of would put her in a vulnerable position. But she also knew that silence would only perpetuate the cycle. She could either sit back and accept the status quo, or she could use her voice to make a difference. The decision wasn't easy, but in the end, it felt necessary. She would speak at the seminar, but not just as a professor. She would speak as a Black woman who had faced the system's biases firsthand, and she would demand that those in power, like Judge Bennett, take responsibility for their actions. She wasn't just going to let this moment pass. If she had learned anything, it was that the law wasn't only about statutes and precedents. It was also about people with real lives, real struggles, and real stories. The stage was set. Angela Matthews was ready. The day of the seminar arrived, and Angela felt a mixture of nerves and determination. She had spent the last week preparing her speech, carefully balancing her thoughts and emotions. She had to strike the right tone, one that was firm but not hostile, passionate but not overbearing. This was a rare opportunity to speak directly to the people who could influence real change in the justice system. She couldn't afford to squander it. The venue was a grand, austere conference hall within the courthouse, filled with judges, lawyers, and legal scholars. The room was lined with dark wood paneling, the long rows of seats arranged like a courtroom. Angela could feel the weight of that history in the walls, but today she hoped that history would bend toward progress. As she entered the room, Judge Bennett was already there, standing by the podium, looking uncharacteristically out of place in his formal suit. His gaze met hers, and he gave a small nod, as if acknowledging the unspoken tension between them. There was a tentative respect in his eyes, but Angela could see the uncertainty there too. He had invited her to speak, but now that the moment had come, she could tell that he wasn't entirely sure what to expect. Angela took her place at the table, scanning the crowd. There were several judges she recognized from local courts, some district attorneys, and even a few public defenders. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. This wasn't just a seminar. This was a reckoning. When the session began, Judge Bennett stood at the podium, introducing the topic of the seminar: bias, fairness, and the role of empathy in the judicial system. His voice was steady, but there was an edge to it, a subtle undercurrent of self-awareness that Angela hadn't expected. He was acknowledging his own limitations, even if only in a small way. Today, he began, his gaze sweeping the room. We're here to discuss a difficult truth. The legal system, for all its ideals of fairness, is not immune to bias. Whether we like it or not, we bring our own experiences, our own perspectives, into the decisions we make. And it's time we face that reality. Angela couldn't help but feel a slight sense of vindication. He was admitting what she had been saying all along. But now, it was time for her to speak, and she wouldn't hold back. When she stood to address the room, there was a palpable shift. All eyes were on her, and for a moment, she felt the weight of their scrutiny. But then, she remembered her purpose. She remembered why she was there. "Thank you, Judge Bennett," Angela began, her voice calm but filled with purpose. "I appreciate the opportunity to speak today, though I have to admit, this feels somewhat surreal. Just a few days ago, I stood in a courtroom as a defendant, and today, I stand before you as an educator, a woman, and a legal professional. The very same system that fines and punishes individuals is the one we're discussing today." She paused, letting her words settle. She could see a few uneasy glances exchanged among the crowd. This wasn't going to be a comfortable conversation, but Angela wasn't here to make people feel comfortable. She was here to make them think. "I'm not here to point fingers or to cast blame," she continued, her tone measured. "But I am here to remind all of us that justice cannot simply be about the law. It must be about fairness, about empathy, and about seeing the humanity in every person who walks through those doors. When I stood before Judge Bennett, I was treated like just another name on a list. I was dismissed not because of the facts, but because of assumptions, and that is where the system fails." She could see Judge Bennett shifting slightly, but he didn't interrupt. Instead, he listened, his gaze steady, though his expression was tight. "We have to acknowledge that our biases, whether implicit or explicit, shape the way we administer justice. And until we confront those biases head-on, we will continue to perpetuate a system that harms people, particularly people of color. This isn't just about policies. This is about people, real people who, like me, have been judged, dismissed, and overlooked." Angela let her words hang in the air, giving them time to resonate. She knew that this wasn't just about her. It was about every person who had been marginalized by the legal system, every voice that had been silenced by those in power. "I'm not asking for sympathy," she concluded, her voice firm. "I'm asking for accountability. I'm asking for a commitment to change. Because until that happens, the law will remain nothing more than a tool of oppression, and that's something we can never allow." There was a long silence after she finished. For a moment, it felt like the entire room was holding its breath. Then slowly, Judge Bennett stood up, and Angela met his gaze. He didn't speak immediately, but when he did, his voice was steady and clear. "Thank you, Dr. Matthews," he said, "for reminding us all of the real work that needs to be done. I think we have a lot to reflect on." And for the first time, Angela felt like the system might actually be listening. The seminar concluded with a sense of quiet reflection that lingered long after the formalities had ended. Angela felt a strange combination of relief and uncertainty as she gathered her notes. She had spoken her truth, but now, in the aftermath, she was left wondering what would come of it. Judge Bennett's words were powerful, and there was a genuine shift in the room during her speech. People were talking, exchanging glances, and some even approached her afterward to thank her for her honesty. But was it enough? Was it enough to change minds? To truly alter the course of the justice system? As Angela exited the hall, Judge Bennett caught up with her. He didn't offer any immediate words of praise or apology. Instead, he simply walked beside her in silence for a moment, his hands clasped behind his back. It wasn't until they reached the lobby that he spoke. "You were right, Dr. Matthews," he said quietly. "I thought I understood fairness. I thought I knew what it meant to be impartial. But I realize now, I've been blind to the deeper issues at play. I'd spent my career focusing on the law itself, but I never truly considered the people behind it." Angela glanced at him, noting the sincerity in his voice. For the first time, she saw him not as a judge, but as a man struggling to come to terms with his own limitations. The realization felt bittersweet. "You're not the only one," Angela replied. "I've seen so many good people get lost in the system because they don't recognize how their personal biases shape the way they interact with others. It's not enough to just follow the rules. We have to be willing to question them too." Judge Bennett nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I think I understand now, and I'm willing to do that. But I need your help." Angela stopped walking and turned to face him. "Help? How?" "I've been given a platform in the legal community. I've been on the bench for years, but I've never really used my position to advocate for change. I think it's time for that to change," he said, his voice tinged with a mixture of determination and vulnerability. "I'd like you to help me put together a series of workshops, a kind of ongoing discussion within the judiciary, focused on recognizing and confronting bias. I can't do it alone, but I want to start making real changes." Angela was quiet for a moment. The idea of working with Judge Bennett, the very man who would find her just days ago, was unexpected, even a little jarring. But as she thought about it, she realized that this could be the opportunity to make lasting change. Judge Bennett had the influence, and with her expertise and lived experience, they could build something meaningful. "I'm willing to help," Angela said finally, her voice steady. "But we need to be honest about what this will take. It's not just about talking about bias. It's about confronting it head-on. We need to bring people into these conversations who have been marginalized, who can tell their stories. Only then will we truly understand what needs to change." Judge Bennett agreed without hesitation. "I understand, and I'll make sure that's part of it. I want to give people like you a voice, the voices of those who have been silenced for far too long." The two of them stood in the lobby for a while longer, discussing their plans in more detail. Angela outlined some of the key issues she wanted to address: racial profiling, the disproportionate impact of the justice system on marginalized communities, and the need for judges and lawyers to acknowledge their own biases before they could effectively serve justice. It wasn't going to be easy, but Angela felt a spark of hope. This was more than just a lecture. It was the beginning of something real, something that could ripple through the very core of the legal system. As Angela left the courthouse later that evening, her mind was buzzing with ideas. The road ahead would be difficult. She knew that, but for the first time in a long while, she felt like change was possible. Judge Bennett's willingness to listen, truly listen, had opened a door. And with every conversation, every workshop, they could push it open even further. Angela had spent her career teaching the law. Now she was preparing to reshape it. Months passed, and the seeds that Angela and Judge Bennett had planted began to take root. They co-organized a series of workshops that sought to challenge the traditional views of justice and replace them with a more inclusive and empathetic approach. These weren't your typical seminars with legal jargon and abstract theories. They were raw, honest conversations that brought together judges, lawyers, and community leaders, including activists and those who had been directly affected by the legal system. The first workshop was difficult. The room was filled with skepticism. Some judges and lawyers sat with arms crossed, unwilling to fully engage, while others seemed eager to hear what Angela and Judge Bennett had to say. They began by talking about the concept of implicit bias, how it operated in the background of decisions, and how it often shaped outcomes, even when people thought they were being neutral. Angela shared stories from her own life, stories of times when she had been dismissed or misunderstood, simply because of the color of her skin. "I've sat in courtrooms where the judge didn't see me," she told them, "where I wasn't a professor or a lawyer, just another black woman in the crowd. I've been judged before I even opened my mouth, and I know I'm not alone." Judge Bennett, now fully committed to the cause, shared his own experience with his colleagues, speaking candidly about his past mistakes and the lessons he had learned. "I didn't realize how much I was allowing my biases to shape my decisions," he admitted. "I thought I was doing the right thing, but I wasn't. I can't change the past, but I'm here to change the future." By the end of the session, something had shifted in the room. There were no immediate solutions, no magic answers, but there was an unmistakable sense that the conversation was just beginning. People who had once been closed off started asking questions, sharing their own stories, and slowly, the walls came down. The success of the first workshop led to more, and soon, word began to spread. Angela and Judge Bennett worked together to create a curriculum that was part lecture, part discussion, and part reflection. They invited guest speakers from various communities to share their experiences with the justice system. The workshops expanded beyond just the courthouse. They reached law schools, community centers, and even local police departments. Angela found herself traveling across the country, speaking to different groups, each with its own set of challenges, but all struggling with similar issues of bias and fairness. She met with law students who were eager to learn how they could be a part of the change, as well as veterans in the field who had been in the system for years but were now questioning their own assumptions. At one point, Angela and Judge Bennett held a joint session in a small, predominantly black neighborhood where local residents had long been distrustful of the legal system. The session was filled with tension at first. Many of the attendees had personal stories of wrongful arrests, harsh sentences, and bias in their own interactions with the justice system. But as the day wore on, they found common ground. The dialogues were uncomfortable, but they were necessary. Angela realized that this was the heart of the work, creating spaces where people could face uncomfortable truths together. She wasn't just teaching legal theory, she was challenging everyone, including herself, to rethink what justice really meant. It wasn't just about upholding laws or maintaining order, it was about ensuring fairness, about seeing each individual as a whole person, not just a case or a number. As the months turned into a year, Angela saw the results of their efforts. Some judges began to implement changes in their courtroom procedures, offering more opportunities for defendants to speak and be heard. Some law firms started offering pro bono services to marginalized communities, providing legal aid to those who had once been ignored. But more importantly, a shift was happening in the minds of the people who attended the workshops. They were starting to understand that true justice wasn't just a matter of enforcing the law. It was about doing so in a way that was fair, compassionate, and aware of the biases that so often clouded judgment. One evening, after a particularly powerful session, Angela found herself in the courthouse with Judge Bennett once again. It was late, and the building was quiet. They stood together, looking out the large windows, watching the city below. "You were right," Judge Bennett said, his voice filled with quiet reverence. This is real change. We've started something that's going to last." Angela smiled, her heart full. "It's just the beginning," she replied, "but it's a start." And for the first time in a long while, Angela truly believed that the system, with all its flaws and complexities, could be reshaped. With every conversation, every workshop, they were building a foundation for a more just world. And as they looked out over the city, Angela knew that they had just begun to change the course of history.